Hello and welcome to an A-level history revision session looking at how far we agree that there was no significant opposition to the Nazis in the period 1933 to 1939. For the purpose of this revision video, we're going to argue that actually there was some significant opposition. We're going to disagree that there was no significant opposition. We're going to say there was some. The most significant in terms of political opposition is the SPD within the church. It's the confessional church that causes the most opposition. There's some fairly significant opposition, in particular towards the end of this period, 1937 to 39, coming from workers and the youth. There is some limited opposition, but I would say probably not any significant opposition from that particular group. So let's start by looking at perhaps the most significant opposition to the Nazis that comes from political opposition, in particular from the SPD. Even after Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, the SPD were continuing to very openly campaign for election, and that did lead to quite a lot of SA violence against them. And despite that violence, they still continued to campaign against things, even after the Decree for the Protection of the People and State and the KPD being banned after the Reichstag fire in 1933. The SPD voted against the Enabling Act despite intimidation by SS and SA. Many SPD leaders were murdered and placed in preventative custody, and in June 1933 the SPD were banned because they were seen as a party that was hostile to the nation and state because they'd voted against the Enabling Act. But there's a branch of the socialist movement, the International Socialist Militant League, or the ISK, that continued beyond the SPD, and part of the reason for that is that they destroyed their records of membership, so it was much more difficult for the Gestapo and other organisations to actually find them. So whilst mass membership records made the SPD members quite easy to hunt down and to arrest, this breakaway group from the SPD, the International Socialist Militant League, or the ISK, were able to continue opposing the Nazis. So they were smuggling refugees out of the country. They were printing anti-Nazi slogans, so painting anti-Nazi slogans on walls and things like that. And their most famous occasion of doing this was when the first Autobahn was opened in 1935, and all the news crews arrived, and they were going to sort of film it all, and it was a really big propaganda exercise. And the ISK had managed to paint anti-Nazi slogans and anti-war slogans all over the road, the Autobahn, and the kind of the walls and things nearby. And they had to edit the news documentaries and things before they were released, and they had to quickly pour sand over bits of the road and repaint parts of bridges and things to try and hide these anti-Nazi slogans. So in a way I would say this is quite significant opposition, despite the fact that they're maybe not as large in number, despite the fact that they're facing intimidation by the SS and the SA. They're still continuingly, quite openly, with the Enabling Act and with these really quite big publicity stunts, speaking out against the Nazis. It's probably true that there's less significant opposition from the KPD, from the communists, and part of the reason for that is that most of their party leadership was killed in 1933, so about 10% of their leadership was killed after the Reichstag fire. There's no serious challenge to the Nazi party coming from the KPD, probably because of this lack of central coordination. There were some factory cells set up, but information was mainly via word of mouth, and it was much more difficult for them to coordinate opposition. We know that there are other organisations, again, that had limited impact on the Nazis. The Kreisau Circle, for example, if we're looking at the years 1933 to 39, is another example that the political elite they did have very limited impact on the Nazis, that the opposition wasn't significant. They were only really a debating society before World War II broke out in 1939. They met on the estate of a previous commander of the Prussian army, von Moltke, who would have quite liked it if they'd gone back to the old monarchical society they'd had before, where he'd had quite a lot of power. But they don't really take any actual action until World War II, when then they start trying to leak secrets to their allies, and most famously they're involved in a bomb plot against Hitler, although it does fail, in 1944. So political elites didn't have a huge impact on when trying to oppose the Nazis in this period. Similarly, groups who tried to break away from the original Nazi party, like Gregor Strasser and Otto Strasser and Schleicher and people like that, well, not Schleicher so much, but were killed as part of the Night of the Long Knives, so they didn't form any particularly significant opposition to Hitler. And we know that the Night of the Long Knives was also a way of overcoming any kind of opposition from the armed forces as well, and from the SA and from Rom. Rom, obviously, his numbers of people within the SA had grown up to around 2 million by the end of 1934, and obviously Hitler was worried about that. He was worried that there was going to be a second revolution, and Ernst Rom did keep talking about there being another revolution, and I think he would have quite liked to take over control of the army and have that under his control as well, and ultimately him become the leader of Germany. And Hitler manages to overcome that with the Night of the Long Knives. He wins over the army and Hindenburg by doing that as well. So in that way, opposition within his own party is also quite quickly overcome. It's not really significant after 1934. So political opposition really is most significant 1933 to 1934. But we see other opposition rise after this period. So, for example, if we look at the church, we'll see a slight difference. Opposition from the church doesn't disappear quite as rapidly as opposition from political parties does. So we need to consider whether there is any significant opposition. Within the church, obviously, we've got two branches, Catholic and Protestant church. The Protestant church splits into two sections. The Reich Church ends up under Nazi control, really. Ludwig Müller, a Nazi, was appointed as the Reich Bishop, an equivalent of an archbishop, a high-up person overseeing it. There's a group called the German Christians, who are a pressure group within the Reich Church, and they pressure for sort of Nazi banners and things to be displayed in churches, and held mass rallies, and they made people declare their allegiance to the party, and they dismissed around 18 people for being non-Aryan, and all that kind of stuff. So the Reich Church, for a large part, didn't display any significant opposition to the Nazis. However, the split off from this was the pastor's emergency lead, which was led by Bonhoeffer, which was established in 1933, very early on. And later they call themselves, also known as the Confessional Church. And they refused to display swastika flags, and there were mass demonstrations after two of their bishops were arrested. And their speaking out against the Nazis didn't stop quite as early as the political parties that we've seen. So, for example, we know that by 1937, around 700 Protestant or confessional church pastors had been arrested. They spoke out mainly against things like the Aryan paragraph being added to the law, which said that Jewish converts to Christianity would lose their jobs because they weren't of Aryan birth. For example, Niemöller was arrested. However, in a way, their opposition was quite limited in comparison to the SPD and the KPD, and that's partly because their opposition only really focused on church reform. They didn't fully oppose the NSDAP, the Nazis. They focused on the struggle against the Reich Church and trying to get control back over the Protestant church. And although many pastors risked their lives, and they really were doing that when they were speaking out against the Nazi policy for churches, the church as a whole remained silent on most other policies that the Nazis had. So in that way, perhaps there wasn't as significant opposition. Similarly, the Catholic Church, you could argue that there wasn't as significant opposition. And that's partly because initially, certainly, very limited opposition because of the Concordat signed by the Pope, where he agrees that they're not going to speak out against the Nazis so long as the Nazis leave them alone. And obviously, that does change as time goes on. So, for example, 1935 Archbishop of Munster, Galen, issued a pamphlet against the Nazis, and 19,000 people processed in his Easter procession with him to show solidarity. He wasn't actually arrested because he was seen as too important in the Catholic Church, and the Nazis were worried about upsetting too many people. And in 1937, the Pope actually published a document as well, with burning grief, it's called, condemning the Nazi hatred upon the church. Obviously, by 1937, they've started to close down church schools and youth groups and things, replacing them with the Hitler Youth, and he's not very happy about that. And they're smuggling into Germany, secretly printing and distributing these documents with burning grief. And they're going around on bicycle and by foot and reading them out in almost every Roman Catholic service in March 1937. Which is fairly significant in a way, because that message is being spoken to lots of people. However, it's very short-lived as opposition. Because of intimidation and harassment of those that spoke out, it led to local government reports, and by the end of 1937, those local government reports basically say that there's cautious restraint being given by Catholic priests, that they're no longer speaking out against the Nazis because they're too worried about what the consequences of that might be for themselves and for their communities as well. Kind of conversely, for workers, opposition increases as time goes by. And there's much more significant opposition from workers towards the end of this period than there is at the beginning. At the beginning of this period, because trade unions were kind of abolished or absorbed into the DAF, the German Labour Front, in 1933, they didn't have as much of a voice. They weren't as united as maybe they had been before. And propaganda was implying that it was really important that there was loyalty to the national cause, to the country, above class loyalty and things like that. And perhaps initially some people are won over by the promises of the KDF, the DAF and the KDF, the Strength Through Joy, the promises of the tokens towards the Volkswagen and the holidays and things like that. But as time goes on, lots of workers get disillusioned because those promises aren't really being fulfilled. Only 10% of the holidays, for example, were actually going to working class people. And no one really ever, except for Nazi leaders, had enough tokens to get the Volkswagen cars and things like that, the people's cars. So as time goes on, and especially as the number of hours that people are being asked to work rise and their wages fall, there's more discontent. Some of it's minor. So, for example, in 1936, the 17-minute strike at a car factory, which is finished quite quickly. 7 leaders were arrested and imprisoned by the Gestapo very rapidly. 1935, there were 37 strikes. That's around 25,000 workers in total, 4,000 of which were imprisoned. And in a way, you could say that's very limited opposition compared to the number of people perhaps politically going against what Hitler had said. Like the SPD voting against the Enabling Act, and 10% of people voting against things like the plebiscite saying that Hitler shouldn't be the Führer. But by 1937 we see a huge increase. There's 250 strikes, and that's largely because of poor wages and working conditions. And people also were increasingly being arrested for even more serious offences. So 1938 to 39, there's a huge increase in the number of people arrested for sabotage or destruction of machinery. And we also see in 1938 a huge rise in absenteeism. And we know it must be a particular problem because there's really severe penalties introduced for absenteeism. We know the Gestapo, for example, arrested 114 workers at a munitions plant, just one munitions plant, for absenteeism and slow working. So that must have been a problem for the Nazis, especially in this period when they're gearing up for war. So workers' opposition is more significant as a threat to the Nazis in the last years, so 37 up to 39, when absenteeism and slow working could genuinely cause a problem for them in achieving their desires for their 4-year plan and readiness for war. Youth really formed the least significant opposition in this period. We know that there was some opposition from the youth. We know that largely they were controlled, so education had been reformed. We know that Goebbels had encouraged things like book burning of the KPD, Jewish SPD traitors, the democratic books and things like that, to try and encourage youth to not come in contact with materials that might be anti-Nazi in any way. We know the Nazi Teachers League was set up, and anyone who was anti-Nazi was losing their jobs in the teaching profession in schools and in universities. Bernard Rust is put in charge of the Minister for Education and insisted teachers and students meet each other using the Nazi salute. We've got the BDM and the Hitler Youth the Hitler Youth made compulsory in 1936, and the League of German Maidens is made compulsory in 1939. I haven't put that on there, but it is. And there's growing regimentation as part of the policy of Gleichschultung, or bringing people into line and making them comply. And those things, in a way, do actually control the youth, because there's no one speaking out against the Nazis to them, and most of their time is being taken up by Gleichschultung. Wednesday evenings there's compulsory gym, all-day hikes on Sundays, and endless military drills, and most of their free time being taken up in the evenings, or with long school days and things like that. But those things were unpopular. So the youth opposition wasn't necessarily to the Nazi policies as a whole. It was largely just discontent that lives were being perhaps overly militarised and controlled. And we end up with these two particular groups. So the Edelweiss Pirates start in around 1937, just after the Hitler Youth was made compulsory, just the following year, and that happens in the Rhineland area. And it's mainly working class youths. They didn't like the Hitler Youth. And they did things like wearing bohemian clothes and playing band jazz music and American films and things like that. And the swing groups as well. There were middle class youths. They were often seen as an irritant by the Nazis, because they're doing sort of similar things, playing band music and wearing non-German clothing and that kind of thing. But neither of these groups really formed much significant opposition. There's no real arrests or executions or anything like that of these groups during this period. And that's largely because they're not really doing very much damage. They're just not wearing the clothes that they want them to wear, or playing the wrong music. That's not a significant problem to the Nazis, and it's not really going to overthrow them. They weren't widespread enough that they were a significant problem. Not turning up to the odd rally or march. And it's only after 1939, when World War II starts, that there are arrests and executions of those groups, and that's probably because during that period they could potentially pose more of a threat by passing information on to the Allied troops, or helping prisoners to escape and things like that. So in this period, the youth weren't really a significant threat to the Nazis. So overall, do we think that there was no significant opposition to the Nazis? Well, I think that's inaccurate to say that there's no significant opposition. I think the most significant opposition early on comes from the SPD and the International Socialist Militant League. And we can also see that there is some significant opposition from within his party, Rom, and the necessity for the Night of the Long Knives and things like that. Towards the end of the period, the most significant opposition comes from workers. It's a significant threat to the economy, hence why they need to have severe penalties for people who were working too slow or being absentees. And there is some limited opposition from the church, but in many ways it was perhaps not that significant. And the youth as well were of limited significance to the Nazis. It didn't have a huge impact on their ability to rule or achieve their aims. So overall, I would agree to a certain extent. There's lack of opposition that was significant to the Nazis and their cause from the church and from the youth, but politically, early on, there is some significant opposition, and later on, 1937 to 39, from workers. I would highly recommend maybe replanning this question in a minute or two and trying to just jot down key points or key statistics that you would try to remember, or condensing this information onto a flashcard and testing yourself until you can remember the information by heart. Best of luck with your revision.